I created a stop motion animation by stenciling every frame onto a loaf of artisan bread. To find out how I made it, let's first go back to frame 1. Okay, so I have this idea for an animation that I'm excited to try. I've been seeing these videos on TikTok lately of bakers who will use stencils and flour to create designs on their bread. As I'm watching these videos, it's got me thinking, could I create an animation by stenciling every frame of that animation onto an individual loaf of bread? So I have a couple stencils here. I just took a couple yogurt lids, I drew some faces on them, I cut them out, and I'm gonna use these for a quick 2-frame animation test. I wanna have control over how each animation frame turns out. Because the images need to be stenciled on the bread dough before it rises in the oven, it's important that I first create this test to see if this idea could even work. Yeah, I think that's working pretty well. The stenciled image is reading pretty clearly. The biggest problem I see moving forward is just how much bread it's going to take to create this animation. Even just a few seconds of animation is going to require dozens and dozens of loaves of bread. I don't want to create any food waste, but I think I have a solution for that.
Hello?
I have a couple quick questions for you.
Okay.
What is the most loaves of artisan bread you've baked in a day?
Well, that I have actually made or that I think I can make?
How many do you think you can make?
32.
What would it take to do like 50 to 60 loaves? So my mom sells made-to-order baked goods through her home business, Debbie D's. My thought is, if I could just design, animate, and cut out each stencil in my stop motion right before her next vendor show, each loaf could be baked and stop motion animated on the same day. Then those loaves could be sold immediately after while the bread is still fresh, ensuring that no food would get thrown out. How many weeks away is your next vendor show?
1 week from this Saturday or 1.5 weeks from right now.
Okay, so I have a little over a week to finish this animation. The first thing I need to do is just come up with a design. I decided to make a sandhill crane the subject of my animation, being mindful of the fact that this design needs to work on 2 different levels. Not only do the loaves collectively need to create a stop motion, but each individual loaf also needs to have an appealing, standalone design for the customers buying the bread. For this animation, I'm imagining we would start on a flock of cranes. One crane would fly down in front, fly in place for a beat, and then circle back around to rejoin the flock. Obviously, a big heavy crane couldn't just fly in place like a light little hummingbird. But this isn't a nature documentary, it's animation. We have control over how the character moves to make it feel more whimsical. Although I'm not looking to create perfectly naturalistic movement, I would like this crane to still feel like it has some weight to it. Not reality, but believability. I'm looking through footage of cranes to see what aspects of their behavior I could incorporate into my animation to make it feel more believable. When they're flying in the air, their feet follow behind their bodies. But as they come in for a landing, their feet swing out and rock in front of their bodies as they prepare to land. I think incorporating this rocking motion into my animation for when the crane's flying in place, it would really help sell the bird's weight. Okay, I think I have a pretty solid plan in place. Let's jump into animation. To begin, I'm using Adobe Animate. I'm starting by roughing in my crane's keyframes, keeping my drawings loose as I work through the timing and motion of my character. Once I'm happy with the animation, I fill in the in-between frames. For cleanup, I'm creating a second layer above my roughs and drawing on top of my sketches, cleaning up the silhouette of my rough animation and filling in the crane with solid shapes. To create a whole flock of cranes, I'm just bringing my Adobe Animate file into After Effects to copy and paste the crane. To mock up the stencils, I'm creating a circle shape layer and subtracting my animation for the area that will be cut out, then adding a couple handles to the sides. There's some parts here I wouldn't mind tweaking, but the bread needs to be baked tomorrow to have it ready for the vendor show, and I still need to get these stencils cut out. To create the stencils, I'm exporting my animation as a PNG sequence, laying everything out in InDesign, and sending it to Cricut Design Space to be cut out. For the stencil material, I ordered a package of food-safe clear vinyl sheets. Now, all I need to do is line my Cricut's cutting mat with the sheets and cut out the stencils. As the stencils were cut out, I numbered each frame to keep them all in order. Okay, so I have all my film equipment packed up. I have my stencils made. I am a little bit worried about the stencils. when I made my test animation, I had like nice chunky lines so that they would read pretty clearly. But my final animation is a lot more complex. And I'm afraid that there's a little bit too much fine detail in the stencil. Let's hope it works out. Artisan bread dough needs to rise for 12 to 16 hours, so all the bread needed for my animation was mixed up the night before, with an extra 2 loaves made just in case a couple of the loaves didn't turn out. I started by brushing on a layer of water to make the surface of the dough tacky. I pressed my stencil flat on the bread and then used a wand duster to apply a layer of flour. Immediately, I wasn't feeling too confident about how the stenciled images were turning out. The stencils had a lot of fine detail, and the edges of the stenciled flour were looking soupy and undefined. All 4 are going to be baked
At the same time.
Okay. With the bread being baked in batches of 4, the initial results confirmed my fear that this animation could end up a mess. All 4 loaves from the first batch had large cracks, making the images barely legible. I feared that if every image became too distorted, the final animation wouldn't read clearly.
I only made 2 extra, but I can mix up 2 right now that would be ready at the end of the day.
There was still time to mix up 2 more loaves to be baked with the last batch of bread, so I decided to re-stencil the first 4 frames. But this also meant that every frame made for the rest of the day would have to be photographed exactly as is. There's no more time for redos. As the extra bread dough was set aside to rise over the course of the next 12 hours, I got to work stenciling the rest of the images. I didn't have control over how the bread warped in the oven, so I just focused in on improving my stenciling technique. I found that using less water and delicately rubbing the flour to the edges of the stencil was producing much cleaner results. Every frame is going to get better. I continued this process of applying water, dusting flour, and delicately removing the stencil over and over and over for the next 12 hours until every loaf was stenciled and baked. It was only after every loaf was finished that I found an irreversible mistake. As diligent as I had been labeling the stencils and bread, the one thing I hadn't anticipated when writing numbers on clear plastic was that some numbers look frustratingly similar reversed. I ended up getting 2 of the stencils switched around, causing the images to be mirrored on the bread. Having already resorted to using the 4 extra spare loaves and no time to make more bread, I had no choice but to get started on the stop motion. I began by setting up my camera and lights and designing the set where the bread would be photographed. It was then just a process of carefully centering the bread on camera and taking a picture of each loaf. Okay, so it took a lot longer than I thought, but I am finished. I was hoping to be done by like 7 today, and with all my equipment packed up, it is now 10 o'clock, but it's done. We'll see how it turns out. The vendor show went well, and thanks to my mom's bakery business, this project didn't create any food waste. Having been able to step away from this animation and revisit it, I'm surprised to find that it's reading clearly exactly the way it is. I was fully expecting I would need to go into Photoshop to digitally flip the backward stencils. But because both mirrored images were in the moment of the flock of cranes, the inconsistency between frames just makes the cranes look like they're moving faster. I'm finding that these aspects I didn't have full control over have actually become my favorite parts of the animation. I love seeing the different flavors of bread boil in between frames, and there's even something appealing about the cracks and warping in the bread. I want to preserve these natural flaws in the animation, so I'm going to make sure not to distort or warp the original photography. I'm adding a touch of color correction to increase the contrast. For the loaves with a very lightly brown top, I'm just duplicating my animation layer, creating a feathered circle mask, and changing the top layer's blending mode to really make the colors pop. I'm adding a digital camera zoom to make my animation feel a bit punchier, and with that, it's ready to render. The limitations of this project really seem to work in its favor. If I had been given the time to redo everything that I saw as a mistake, I feel the final animation would have just ended up with a lot less personality.